glad that you guys are here tonight. We are in week 3 of our series on emotions. You know, I love Knockout. How many of you guys had fun with that game? It was kind of stressful because then if you get out, especially that second round, you had to go all the way back to the beginning for the around the world knockout. See, for me, when I was in high school or in middle school, growing up, I always played basketball from like 3rd grade on through high school. And so there's plenty of times I can remember getting to the free throw line. And you know, like you've been in basketball before or you've been to a basketball game. And what happens every time somebody's at the free throw line? What happens? Is the gym just as loud as it was before? No. Everything gets quiet. You get up to that free throw line, and then everything gets quiet in the gym. The cheering stops. Everybody looks at you, and everybody leans in on the edge of their seat, waiting to see if you're going to make the basket. And I've been in that position many times. Sometimes when the game was literally on the line. And you know, when you get to that point, I mean, you think knockout was stressful earlier. You get to that point, especially if you know someone's behind you, but you get that point in a game, and you just you have that thought that kind of like whispers in the back of your head, don't miss, don't miss, don't miss, don't miss, don't miss. You guys know what I'm talking about. Maybe it's not knockout for you or a free throw line, but it's like something else important, like a test that you're like, you know, how many of you have taken your ACT or SAT where you have the clock counting down and you know, don't get it wrong, don't get it wrong, don't get it wrong. Like especially SAT, because if you get it wrong, it counts against you, right? So man, do you guys take ACT or SAT? Both? Okay. I took ACT, so I just preferred that because then I could just fill it. Anyway, doesn't matter. You get to that moment of pressure where the pressure's on you. This moment counts. Time seems to stop and stand still for a moment. And you got to either fight through and just do what you're trained to do what you've studied to do what you're ready and prepared to do, or fall on your face in front of everybody, or miss the free throw, or whatever it is. And that pressure, that voice inside your head, that is fear speaking to you. It's that moment where you know that this is really important, this counts, and if I mess it up, it's going to have just major consequences. People are counting on me. My parents are counting on me. My teammates are counting on me. My coach is counting on me. My teachers are counting on me. My friends are counting on me. And you can't mess up. That fear that speaks to you in those moments of crisis, those moments of opportunity, those moments where it's all on the line, that fear speaking to you, that is something that some of us feel every moment of every single day. When we feel like we're going through our normal routines, and to everybody else on the outside of your life looking in, they would say, oh, it's just normal, just going to class, just going to work, just going to the practice, going to the game. But then for you, every single one of those seemingly mundane tasks seems to overwhelm you. There's so much pressure on every little thing in your life. And I know it because I was there not too long ago. I graduated high school. Gosh, I graduated high school 10 years ago this spring, which is weird. I'm a decade out. But it's still, I promise, not that far. You're going to blink one day and you're going to be in my position. You're going to be like, I'm still in high school, right? But you're not. So, I know what it's like when you feel that pressure and but every single moment for some of you, it seems you're living with that whisper in the back of your brain telling you, don't miss, don't mess up, don't trip in front of everybody on the class as the teacher makes you come up and write on the board. Actually, some of you probably like the online stuff for that reason. You don't have to get called out in front of everybody in person. If you get called out, it's on Zoom and it's not as much pressure, right? But man, that moment, that fear, all of us have experienced this from one time or another. It's kept us from trying new things. It's hurt our friendships. It has created this script in our heads that try to convince us about our lives, things that are not true. We know what it's like to live with this paralyzing fear that seems to tell us and direct us not only what to do, but who you are as a person. And that fear can be, again, overwhelming. The crazy thing about fear is that our ability to experience fear at all is what makes us human, right? It's not necessarily a bad thing, because think about it. Fear comes from the fact that we can gather information and think about the future. That moment on the free throw line, you're gathering the information, the weight of this moment, and what it could mean for the future. When you're sitting there and the clock is counting down for that test, when you're auditioning for that part, you know that it causes fear because of what the future could hold for you because of that moment. And that's why I say for some of you, that moment is every moment of every single day, because you feel like everything has to go just right. And that fear can paralyze us, but it's an amazing thing that we get to feel fear or anything at all, but especially fear because it drives us sometimes. A little bit of fear isn't a bad thing. You should be afraid of heights. How many of you are with me in your fear of heights? How many of you, like, you'll stand at the edge of a cliff and look over every day, even if there's nothing blocking you? Y'all are dumb, and you should, like, put on a harness or something, or watch a YouTube video and get your thrill from that. Don't actually lean over the ledge unprotected, right? Because fear protects us. Fear is good in healthy doses, but it's when it becomes something that directs our lives and tries to identify who you are that it becomes something a little bit out of line. When it becomes the boss of us, when it becomes something that is consuming every thought of our lives every single day. When we feel like maybe it's not every thought, but it's a consistent thought. Maybe I should use that word. It's not every minute of every day, but it's a consistent thought throughout your day. How many of you can relate with me? There's something that just inside of you, when you remember it, your heart starts to flutter and race a little bit more because you're reminded, even though you forgot for a minute, you're reminded of what is at stake in your life. And you don't want that pressure to defeat you, to squash you, to count you out. You want to overcome those fears and become confident because of them rather than let them direct your life. And that's a pretty dang hard thing to do. And the thing is, in this whole series, we've been talking about emotions. We've talked about how we all feel them, we all experience them. There's nothing bad about that, and there's no shame in feeling emotions because God created our emotions. It's hardwired into us, and it's how we're supposed to filter experiences through life, because if we had no emotions, we would be what? Like robots. We would be machines. We would have no personality. We would have no drive to do anything, but we are more complicated than that. We can feel. We have emotions, and those emotions drive us sometimes to do things that matter a lot. But whether it's fear, whether it's anger, whether it's whatever else, when it comes into your life and starts to direct you and be the boss of you and tell you what to do, tell you what to think about yourself and about others, that's when we have problems with our emotions. When we're not able to think critically about a situation going on, when we're so caught up in that emotional moment that we can't step back and see everything else in the big picture, we can't see beyond the minute we're in, that emotion takes over us, that's when we're maybe being a little too slaves, too oppressed as slaves by our emotions. You guys get what I'm saying. The words are hard. But we know that emotions are good until they are not. And I like the passage we're going to look at today. Actually, we're going to look at a few, but they all go together, I promise. And it's about this idea of fear. And you know, throughout this whole pandemic, there's been a lot of talk, especially among Christians and churches, about this idea of faith versus fear. You guys heard that? Heard that? Sometimes, like, you know, people use that for all kinds of things. Like, well, if you're using a mask, then you're giving into your fear and not your faith. I don't think that applies. I don't think that makes sense. But I understand the point people are making. But you hear this, like, faith versus fear. But the reality is we put our faith in all kinds of things, right? Like, you're putting your faith in the chairs you're sitting in right now to not drop you on the floor. By sitting in the chair, it doesn't mean you're giving into fear. It just means that you have faith in something that's worth having your faith in, right? And that it has nothing to do with your faith in God. It has no conflict there in your spiritual life. It's just we make faith decisions every day without even recognizing it. So when we talk about faith versus fear, I like the way that these passages put it in context, and it gives us a lens. It gives us a pair of glasses in which to view this issue and this topic, especially when it comes to letting anxiety or fear take over our lives. This speaks right to the heart of all of that. It speaks right to the heart of that in everyday life, but it also speaks to the heart of that just in light of the world we're living in right now. And so I love where we're going with this. But Jesus, he's with his disciples. You know, his disciples were the people closest to him, right? Several of them wrote books that are in our New Testament, or letters, or just we call them gospels or epistles, but they're letters or just documents written in order to record something that happened in history. And so in the Gospels, Matthew wrote a lot about his experience as following Jesus during Jesus' time on earth. And so Matthew is writing and this is what he says at one point in chapter 10 of his Gospel. And this is Jesus talking. He's talking to his disciples. He says, I'm going to send you out like sheep among wolves. Now, if you read that, what do you think of, right? When you think of sheep and wolves, are those a good combination? Why not? Because sheep are prey, right? And wolves are predators. So basically Jesus is telling them, I want you to go out, I'm going to send you out, but you're going to be like prey in a den of predators. And his disciples are probably looking at him like, I have no idea what you mean by that, but that's kind of a scary thought. I'm going to send you out like sheep among wolves. And in order to put this into context, you kind of have to understand what happened right before this. What's happening that's leading Jesus to say something that's kind of radical like that. And so you go back in a couple of chapters, and this is what happens. See, Jesus and his disciples were going on a little field trip. They were going in one of their boats, and they were going across the Sea of Galilee, and it's night, and Jesus has been teaching and performing miracles, and so he's exhausted, and he probably didn't get his alone time that day. He didn't get his me time, so he's a little bit exhausted, and they're going on this out to sea across the Sea of Galilee, and suddenly, this is what Matthew records a couple chapters earlier, a furious storm came up on the lake so that the waves swept over the boat. So his disciples are out there. They're in the middle of the storm. If you've grown up in church, you probably heard this story a little bit, but they're out there on the Sea of Galilee. This massive storm comes in, and these are experienced fishermen, right? Peter, James, John, Andrew, they were fishermen. Like, this is what they did before they followed Jesus. They know what it's like to be in the waters. They know what it's like to be in some maybe turbulent waters, have some waves, but they were terrified at this, which is a big deal. It's saying a lot that the experienced fishermen were terrified by the situation. And so they come up and they're thinking, hey, Jesus, they tap on him, and what's happening? Jesus is sleeping. They tap on him to wake him up, which I don't know how Jesus was sleeping in this storm, but he was, okay? Let's go with it. And like I said, he was probably exhausted from teaching and all that stuff. And so they say, Lord, save us, we're going to drown. And they're freaking out, which, rightly so. And Jesus gets up and he doesn't get all in a tizzy. He doesn't like go, oh, why didn't you wake me sooner, right? What's going on? Like, he just wakes up. He kind of looks around. And I like to try to imagine this happening because I can't really imagine how this would play out. But you got to picture Jesus is, on the bottom deck or something if they had a boat that had more than one level. And because otherwise, I don't know how you'd sleep with that. But he gets up and he looks around and he says, you have little faith. Why are you so afraid? And he says this to his disciples, like I said, kind of calm. No matter how scary the circumstance was, Jesus remained calm. He didn't freak out at all. He knew who was actually in control. And he goes up there, and he does what? You guys have probably heard this story. What happens? You guys awake? What happens? The disciples wake Jesus. He says, you have little faith. He goes up there, and what happens? He calms the storm. Peace, be still. And the waves go. And the disciples say this, what kind of man is this? Even the winds and the waves obey him. Right? So they were in this moment that they had every reason to be afraid as experienced fishermen in the middle of the sea with a storm that is tossing the boat around. They're all probably sopping wet. And Jesus comes and he just calms it. Even the winds and the waves obey him. And in a moment where their fear was taking over, Jesus had confidence. In that moment, their confidence in Jesus overwhelmed their fear of the storm because they saw the power that Jesus wielded. They saw what he could do. They saw what he was capable of. And so I think at that point, Jesus is taking them. He's taking them through the storm. And I think Jesus kind of knew what was going to happen in hindsight because, Jesus was always making everything a teaching moment with his disciples. He probably was like, these are a bunch of fearful men. In fact, in order to follow a rabbi back in that time, they had to be like the top students, the A students, the valedictorians of like scripture study. They had to be the ones who won all the challenges in Bible Bowl. They had to be the ones that got everything right. They memorized the entire Old Testament from start to finish. And then if they were good enough, the rabbi chose them to be their disciple. These guys, they didn't have that kind of confidence. They flunked out of that school. They were fishermen. They didn't get to follow a rabbi around. They weren't chosen. And so all their life, they've not been the enlightened one. They've not been a religious thing. So they probably have no confidence. and no reason really to understand why Jesus would choose them to be their disciples. You guys ever been in that position where someone put you in charge of something and you feel like, I don't feel like I'm ready to do this, but all right, you put me here. And so that's probably what his disciples are thinking, and Jesus is going, you have little faith. He's probably thinking, I need to teach them what real faith looks like. So he takes them out there. The storm is overwhelming, and Jesus wanted to teach them. He wanted to show them that there is someone bigger and more capable than whatever it is that they're afraid of. That was a pretty dramatic example, I would say. I think that gets the point across. Calms the waves in the middle of the storm, where a bunch of experienced fishermen were about to wet themselves even more than they already were. And so I think he made his point. But back to the conversation about Jesus saying, I'm going to send you like sheep among wolves. Remember that when Jesus was telling them that a couple chapters later? Back to that conversation. Jesus' followers, he follows that up with this. After they've experienced this whole traumatic experience with the storm and all that, Jesus kind of sums up that whole thing about sheep and wolves with this. He says, do not be afraid of those who kill the body but cannot kill your soul. Right? Do not be afraid of those who can kill the body. In other words, don't be afraid for your own life. Which sounds a little counterintuitive because, right, fear is supposed to keep you alive in dangerous situations. He says, that's not what you should really be afraid of. They may take your life. They may take the things that you care about the most. They may take your family. They may take the things from you like scholarships and things like that are valuable to you. They may take your opportunities away. They may take things away from you. Increasingly in our culture today, those things are happening to Christians because Christians are being discriminated against. And maybe you lose some standing where you want to apply to. You don't get hired. You don't get accepted into that school. You don't, whatever it is. Maybe, and you have to blame that on your faith. But Jesus says, don't be afraid of those things who can kill your body, kill your opportunities, kill what's going on in your life, but rather fear the one who has more of an eternal grasp on your soul. In other words, he's kind of drawing a line. He's saying, who do you belong to? Do you belong to yourself? Do you belong to the things that cause you the most fear? Or do you belong to me, who is able to overcome any storm in your life and can calm the waves? Don't be afraid of those things. It's like he's saying, remember that boat ride? You were afraid of the wrong thing. You were afraid of the wrong thing. And so Jesus goes on. Imagine like his disciples probably didn't get the point. And in fact, they still won't get the point, but I'll come back to that. Jesus goes on here in chapter 10. He says, are not 2 sparrows sold for a penny? Yet not one of them will fall to the ground outside your Father's care. And talking about God there. And even the very hairs on your head are all numbered. So, don't be afraid. You are worth more than many sparrows. In other words, if you think God cares so much to take care of those stupid birds that are annoying and eat crop and peck at things that you don't want them pecking at, don't worry about those. If God takes care of them, he knows the numbers of hairs on your head. He knows everything about you, in other words. He knows you more intimately than anybody else, and he's got you covered. If he's going to take care of those things, you can trust that he's got your best interests in mind. And you don't have anything to be afraid of except him. Proverbs says, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of all wisdom. It's the beginning of all knowledge. Because once you find that you're only afraid of God, then you don't have anything else to be afraid of. You don't have anything else to be afraid of. It doesn't mean you shouldn't try at things and just think that God will work everything out, but it does mean no matter what outcome happens from your situation, you know that God is in control. Because God knows all about your situation. He knows all about what is driving your fear, and he's with you in the middle of it. So they get back from the lake. They get off after that storm, and the crowd that was following Jesus on the other side of the lake had met him over there, and so Jesus begins teaching again, right? And he starts teaching, and in fact, there were thousands of people there. And so Jesus turns to his disciples and he says, they've been following me. I got to give them something to eat. His disciples look at him like, I'm sorry, what was that? We barely have enough food for ourselves. You want to feed, thousands of people, right? And so Jesus finds this boy and then and then separates out his bread and his fish. You guys remember this story? He takes the loaves and the fish, he gives it to the disciples. They spread out. They feed the 5,000, which is only 5,000 men, which means there were probably, if you include women and children, some people on the lower estimate 8 to 12,000, but some people on the higher end estimate 15 to 20,000 people. I don't know how many exactly, but let's just say a lot of people were there. An unreasonable amount to think that you could actually feed. And so Jesus performs this miracle. He feeds all of these people, and he performs this miracle, and the disciples are sitting there, and they're going, wow, this guy not only can control the waves, but he can, feed our bellies, which is nice. And so Jesus says, okay, I want you to go back on the other side of the lake again, but this time start without me. I'll meet you over there. Remember, Jesus needs his me time, so he goes up to a mountain to pray. He sends them to go, and which, by the way, is a nice lesson for us, that no matter how busy you are, it's really good to take some time and just spend in solitude with God, because apparently that's what rejuvenated and filled Jesus back up after hours of teaching and ministry, and which is very stressful, I imagine. But he goes up there, sends the disciples on their way, and they're like, okay. And then guess what happens? You guys have probably heard this story too. You probably didn't know it was all kind of in sequence this way, though. Jesus goes to pray, that sends his disciples on ahead of him, and go figure, another storm happens. But this time, what's different than the last time? What's different this time than the last time? Jesus isn't there with them. So I can imagine the disciples learned their lesson that Jesus is more powerful than the waves, and yeah, that's great. We don't have anything to fear. And then Jesus, who's the one they're supposed to have faith in, he's not with them now. And they're like, this is very different. Now we're surely going to die because Jesus isn't here to save us this time. And the storm is raging, and they're, probably sopping wet again. They're probably in the same clothes. They're like, I just got dry, and then Jesus meets them, not on the other side of the lake, but in the middle of the lake, walking on the water. You guys have heard this story. He's walking out there. The disciples, they see him, and they get terrified again, because not only are the waves crashing around them, but what they can see looks like a ghost coming after them. They're like, surely the sea is haunted, and we're all toast. And Jesus comes out, and he says this. He says, take courage, it is I. And this is Jesus trying to remind them all of the lessons from all the field trips they've taken so far. And they've seen the miracles, they've heard the teaching, yet fear was still controlling them. Their fear of inadequacy, that they weren't enough. Their fear that the waves were going to overtake them, of whatever storm they were going on. And how many of us, we've heard the stories in Sunday school growing up, we've heard the stories in the Bible, we've heard how Jesus takes care of us, but then when we don't see him with us right now with our own two eyes, we fear for every situation going on in our hearts. For every situation going on in our lives, we are still sometimes so overwhelmed by fear. And the lesson I think Jesus wanted to teach his disciples and wants to teach you and I today is that even when we don't see him, he is with us. He cares for us. He's here for us. And just like the sparrows, God is going to take care of us. Don't be afraid of what might happen to your life physically here, because God's got you. And if you do live by whatever you're afraid of, God is using that and using you and positioning you for something very important. And oftentimes, the disciples, God used their own physical deaths to further his purpose and further his kingdom. We have the English translation of the Bible because of martyrs who are willing to die for their faith in order to translate it so that we can read what we study today in Scripture. So God uses even death for his purposes, and they're much better off now. They don't have to suffer anymore. But Jesus is teaching his disciples, he says, don't fear, it's me. And in fact, his disciples, you'd think they would get it at this point, that Jesus is in control of everything. Jesus has control of the waves. Jesus has control of food supply. He has control over sickness. He has control over everything. They have nothing to fear because Jesus, he even raised people from the dead. And they got to be right there next to him watching him do it. And yet, when trouble came, it was amazing how quickly their faith left them. I think that's why Jesus is saying, you have little faith. You don't get it yet. These things can't touch you when you give your life to me. That's not something you should really be afraid of. And the night that Jesus was arrested, you know what happened? His disciples, they abandoned him. Because if they arrested Jesus, then they could arrest them too. Because they're just the little guys. Jesus is the big man. If they can arrest him, then they can arrest me. And then at Jesus' crucifixion, when he's hanging there on that cross, you know where his disciples were? Not with him. How many of you, you've felt the sting of friends abandoning you in your hour of need? Jesus knows what that feels like. And his disciples had left him. They'd scattered, and the day after Jesus died, you know where they were? They were all hiding together in the upper room, terrified for their lives, because now their leader, their teacher, is gone. Everything that they thought he was going to accomplish, they thought ended with him there hanging on the cross. And they're terrified for their lives. But it wasn't until the resurrection and Jesus left them physically and sent them his Holy Spirit that they had the courage to take on the entire world. It wasn't until Jesus physically left and he told them that last night in the upper room at the Last Supper, he said, I must leave so the advocate, I must leave so my Spirit can come and dwell inside of you. Guys, do you get that? That the Spirit of God lives and dwells and moves inside of you. We sometimes complain because we don't get to see Jesus face to face like the disciples, but that didn't even fix their fear. It wasn't until he left and that they had his Spirit living in him that their lives were so radically changed that they were able to change the face of the planet. 300 years after Jesus died on that cross, Christianity became the main official religion of Rome, the empire that once squelched them. That's how powerful this became. The more they killed the Christians, the more they grew. God used their physical death to grow his purpose and his kingdom. And now today, 2,000 years removed, we have the same opportunity. Despite anything that's going on in our world, Christianity has survived much worse. And God uses moments of suffering, moments of fear as opportunities to increase our faith in him. And that's something special to be a part of, and that is something worth worshiping. Because of the resurrection, the disciples and anyone who followed Jesus could put fear in its place. Remember, if Jesus hadn't risen from the dead, then our faith would be nothing. We would have no reason to gather here. Jesus would have been a lunatic teacher that taught really cool stuff that then was killed for it because he's out of line by his own religious leaders and by the government in charge that saw him as a rival. But he didn't stay in the grave. He got up. And because of that, our living hope is not in a story, but in a person and in the Spirit dwelling and living inside of you if you've accepted Jesus to be your Lord and Savior. And that is something that is worth putting my faith in. No matter what's going on in the world, no matter how dark it seems like Christians are being persecuted, our freedoms are getting taken away, freedom of speech, you can't say what you want online, you'll get censored, it's hard to find accurate information. It seems like COVID's shutting everything down. Well, guess what? Christianity has survived much worse. And I'm not saying that to belittle our issues. I'm saying that to let us know that this is an opportunity for God to bolster up and make your faith take over your life in a way that it never has before. Imagine a year from now when some of you are in college, when some of you are upperclassmen, when some of you are a year removed from this situation, and you have the opportunity to look back and say, I am at a different place with God because of the hardship that I went through. And as much as it sucked, I'm thankful for it because I wouldn't be the person I am today, and God wouldn't have been able to use any other situation like he used that one in order to increase my faith. See, circumstances or fear are nothing more than an opportunity for the Spirit to work inside your heart. All of a sudden, everything else just doesn't seem as scary anymore. Not because there's not things that we should be afraid of, but because God is so much bigger than our fears. We don't have to live in fear, and we don't have to live like it's in charge of our lives, telling us what to do. Peter, who was the one in that story when Jesus was walking on the water, Peter actually calls out to Jesus. It says, because Jesus says, take courage, it's I, it is me, and Peter reaches out and he says, he's the only disciple that did this. He said, Jesus, if that's you, Lord, if that's you, call out to me and I'll walk out to you. Right? Imagine you're in that situation. You probably would be like, get in the boat and calm the storm like you did last time. But Peter's like, no, call me out to you. That sounds bizarre. It is bizarre. But that's what he did, and that's how big his faith became in that moment. So Peter gets out and he walks in that storm. And even then, while he's literally walking on water, he looks at the waves for a split second and begins to sink. And Jesus uses it as a teaching opportunity to say, he reaches out his hand, he grabs it, he doesn't let him fall. He said, have faith in me. That same Peter who ended up denying Jesus, the same Peter who ended up cussing out some little girl because she was pointing out that he was one of Jesus' disciples And he was like, no, I don't know her, get away from me. And the same Peter that abandoned Jesus in his hour of need, the same Peter that cut off the dude's ear during the arrest because he didn't get what it was all about, that same Peter writes letters to the church later. And this is what he says, reflecting on those experiences, reflecting on his time with Jesus on earth, and reflecting on the time that God had moved in his life since he left and since he had embodied his Spirit. He says this in 1 Peter chapter 5, verse 7, cast all your anxiety on him because he what? Because he cares for you. That is a comforting thought. Cast all your anxiety on him because he cares for you. Peter was a fisherman, so it's only, it only is fitting that he uses fisherman analogy, casting your nets, cast your cares. You physically have to do something. You have to give your fears to God. You can't just sit there and do nothing and ask God to take it from you. You have to literally say the prayer and focus on, tell God about the things you want him to take. You can't just hope that the situation gets better. You have to cast it on God. And he will care for you. Remember it this way, because of Jesus, fear doesn't have to be the boss of you. Just practically speaking, what this could look like for your life is, one, to name whatever it is you're afraid of, to put words around it, and then to write it down. Write down those things. I know it's very therapeutic. It sounds like I can just do that in my head. But unless you're in the practice of doing this on a regular basis, which most of us aren't, you need to write it down. You need to make a physical representation of what it is that is, and it'll also force you to be specific and to think and identify where the root of your fear is coming from. So write it down and then throw it to Jesus. Maybe that means you write something like, write something along the lines of, I'm afraid of fill in the blank, right? I'm afraid of what will happen if, and then fill in the blank. Be specific. I'm afraid that if I fail this test, I will not get into this college and do what I've always wanted to do with my life. Name the fear, write it down, be specific. And then throw it to Jesus. Maybe skip a line and write this. Something along these lines. Jesus, I am giving you my fear of, fill in the blank. I'm giving you my fear of letting everyone down. I'm giving you my fear of not being good enough. I'm giving you my fear of whatever it is, fill in the blank. I'm afraid of all that stuff I wrote before, but those are what-if situations. And here's what is true. You care for me, and even though it doesn't always feel like it, I'm choosing to believe that you're bigger than any fear that I face. Since you defeated death, you can handle my fear. I give it to you. Please replace my fear with confidence in you. I trust you. Write something down. Write something down that says that this is what I'm afraid of, and God, this is what I want you to do in light of those fears. Put your faith and your trust in him. And lastly, talk to someone about your fear. Talk to a small group leader, talk to somebody, talk maybe your parents, talk to a mentor figure of some kind about this. You need someone who's a couple steps ahead of you in life that can look back and give you not only their wisdom from their experience, but also encourage you in your faith. Talking to friends who are Christians is great, but it's different than having somebody who is a mentor figure in your life that can look ahead and give you more wisdom than a peer who has the same life experience as you at this point. So find someone that you can talk to about that. So while we can learn from our emotions, we need to know that because of Jesus, they don't have to be the boss of us. Fear does not have to be the boss of us. And as we head to small group together, let's be bold and courageous enough to share the fears that we face. And together, we can help each other say, fear not. Let me pray, and then we'll be dismissed into our small groups.